All right, so in this video, we're going to create JavaScript dependent dropdowns. So let me show you what the end product is going to look like. So right here, I have this first dropdown. If I select, for example, Toyota, see it filters to all Toyotas here. And if I pick one of these options, I have the options for that particular model. And if I switch to Camry, let's say we have these. And then this is another example of a dropdown on the same page when we have two countries. Now in each country, see, you can pick one and then it goes to regions or states. So something like that. That's just two examples. So the final code we're gonna write to get to this is gonna be pretty simple. So the end result in the code should be a plain HTML file with just two groups of select elements here, and we just have IDs for each one of these items. And all we need to do to convert these to a dependent dropdown is to have something like an array of arrays like this. And to apply this to our dropdowns, we simply have to just write this simple line of code, and that's going to create that dependent dropdown. And then the same, see, this is the 4 level, and you could do this for any levels. So you could do 7 levels, 8 levels, and it would pretty much be the same thing. Now, to be able to understand everything I'm going to be doing in this video, as a bare minimum, at least for the first half, you're going to need to have some basic skills like knowing HTML, understanding basic JavaScript, and how to grab elements from the page, assign event listeners. So if you don't know any of these, I have a tutorial series covering all of that, which I'm going to link in the bottom of this video so you can check those out. And the second thing you're going to need to be able to go through this is understanding array methods for each map, this sort of things. So if you don't know these, I'm going to also link to another set of videos covering those as well. Now, the second half is probably going to be a lot more complicated. We're going to get to things like classes, class methods, and closures, and things like this. So let's just get to it. So it's going to be a progression. So in the beginning part, we'll just do something basic. So we can do maybe 2 or 3 levels of dependent dropdowns. But then we're going to take that whole concept of dependent dropdowns and make something that will be able to do any level of dependent dropdowns. And if necessary, you can do multiple dependent dropdowns on the same page easily without having to copy and paste a bunch of code. So the software I'm going to use for this is going to be Visual Studio Code. If you want to use the same software, you can go ahead and download it from code.visualstudio.com. Hopefully you already know how to create HTML or JavaScript files. I'm going to get started by creating a new HTML file. And I'll also just create a JavaScript separately from this. So I'll go to my HTML site. I'll just do exclamation tab, and that's a Visual Studio Code thing, or if you're using Amit, you can do this. Otherwise, you would have to just type all of this HTML. Now in here, we're gonna have the body. So what I'm gonna do in the body, I'm gonna create a select box. I'll just copy this, give these some IDs. So the first one will be, let's say, level 1. And the second one will be level 2. And generally speaking, if you were just creating this, you would have options right here. And this is where you would list different options for level 1. And then as a second level, you would want to have different things depending on what you pick in this first level. Now, I'm going to have to link to this script file that I did here, and I can do it by doing a script tag here. And the source for this is going to be this dropdown JS. So that should just link this to this JavaScript so we can actually write our code separately from our HTML side. So there are a lot of ways to lay your data for something like this. So for me, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use array of arrays just because I also want this to be possibly used in Google Sheets for people who want to do it. And if you're getting data from Google Sheets, you're probably going to get it in that format. Now, if you're dealing with NoSQL databases, you would probably want to have a little different approach for your data. But for this, let's just create a quick array of arrays. So hopefully I got all of this right. If I didn't, don't yell at me. Basically, this is going to be our array of arrays. So what should happen if we select, for example, Toyota in our dropdown? We should just take all of this and filter it to just Toyotas. So in order for me to do this, so even though I'm using var for this section, I'm going to be using the rest of the stuff with a current JavaScript. I'll show you how we can take all of that and convert it to a browser compatible version, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this list and try to filter it to just Toyota. So to do something like that, I would have to take that array data and run a filter on it. In this filter, I'm going to go and do an R for a row. I'm calling it R. And I'll do an arrow function. So for each row, we want to only return the rows where the first column is Toyota. So we can do that by taking the first column, which by 0 index is R0, and making it sure it equals to Toyota. So if I save this in a variable, if I console log this filtered array, we should see how this works. So I'm going to save this, go back to my HTML, and fire up a live server. You can also just go to your folder and open that HTML, dropdowns HTML file, but I'm going to be using this. That's what I got. I got this list that has nothing to do with our JavaScript code that was just pre-populated manually. And if I open the console, you'll see I got the log of the array and it only has Toyotas. Now, what I want to do, I need to populate the second dropdown with things that are in the second column of this list. So Corolla and Camry. But we only want unique values list. We don't want to put like Corolla 3 times in the list and Camry twice. We just want to have one Corolla, one Camry. And to do that, I'm going to go back and let's open our JavaScript. And I need to take this filtered array and get a unique list. So to get a unique list, we can do it by using a set. That's what I'm going to call this. So I'm going to do a new set. And what a set is basically, it's similar to array list, but you can only have unique values in it. So now what we can do, we can populate this by looping through this filtered array and putting things in the set. In order for me to do that, I'm going to take that filtered array and I'm going to run for each loop on this. And for each row in that new filtered array, so this will be now filtered to just Toyota on top here. Now for each row, so we need to take the second column, which again with 0 index is 1, and just add it to this set. So that's called unique options. So to do that, I'm going to just do this. I'm going to say unique options dot add and add that R1, which is the value from the second column, to that set. And what this is going to do, populate that set with unique values only. So right now, if I just log that, let me actually log both. So I'll do filtered array and unique values. So if I go back and check what happened here, see I have two things. I have this array, which is just this with Toyotas. And if I look at a set, you can see it just has Corolla and Camry. So it just got unique values. Now I don't want this to be a set though. I want to convert this back to a regular array. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to go back, create a variable for this, and use deconstruction to make that an array. So I'm going to take this unique options and do this. And what this should do, it should now be an array. So if I save this and go back and look, see, now we have those two options, but now it's an array. It's not a set anymore. Now, once I get those unique options out of the list, I need to populate those options in this second dropdown. Now, the way I can do that, I can first find that second dropdown. So the second dropdown is this one, has an ID level 2. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to do document.getElementById, and the ID is level 2. So again, let's save this in some sort of variable here. So that will be this select right here. And what we need to do, we need to populate this options inside of that select. So to do that, we need to create those options. And we need to create those options using this unique list. So in order for me to do that, I'm going to take that unique list and run a for each loop on this. And for each, again, I'm going to call this row. Actually, let's call this one item because there are no rows anymore. So for each item in that list, so what we're going to do, we're going to create this option element so we can populate them. So I'm going to create an element here. So we're going to take our document object and do create element. And the element we're creating is the one that's called option. So now with that option element, we need to populate, see this inner part of it with those options. So I'm going to take that option, set the text content, which is that inner part of that. Well, we don't need the quotes here. It's just going to be whatever this value is going to be out of our array. So that's first going to be, Corolla and Camry, whatever all of that is. Now, once I do that, then I need to make sure I'm adding this option to this select box. So I'm going to take that and do append child. And the child will be appending will be that option, just like this. So if I save this, go back to this, you'll see that this is already populated to Corolla and Camry. But none of this is really tied to anything here. So if I'm changing this, this doesn't change. First, I don't need this console logs anymore here. I'm just going to create a function out of this code that I just built. And if you look here, where we started from is this data, right? So that should accept some sort of data. We also filtered it to Toyota. So the first level we're filtering, basically. That's what I'm calling that for now. So I'll just take all of this code, cut it, and move it inside of this function. So now the data is going to be this data passed from here. Maybe I should call it something else than this one. Let me actually rename this to my data so that it doesn't match anymore. So now this data is going to be basically the variable in this function. And instead of this Toyota, we're going to use this level 1 filter. So I'm going to copy that and paste it right over this thing. So now to be able to run this function, we need to run that function and pass some arguments to it. So if I do make dropdown, which is that function on top, and we pass this data, which is called my data here, to that function, and filter that to Toyota and save it. If I go back and look at what happened, it should be the same thing. And if I go back and change this Toyota, let's say to Honda, save it, and go back and look at what happens, we should have now options for Honda. Now, finally, we need this to happen when we select this first box. And when we change this to one of the other makes, we want this to run and basically change this to whatever it needs to change to. So I'm going to create a function again. And this function is just going to grab whatever's in this first dropdown. And then it's going to just populate this second dropdown with appropriate options. Let's just call this apply dropdown. So in this function, I'm going to first go to my document and find the other element. And the ID of that other element is level 1. So what I need from that, I just need the value. I'm going to save it again. This is actually supposed to be select level 2 on top, not level 1. I don't know why I called it level 1, but anyways, doesn't matter. So I'm going to change this to level 2 just to make it more clear. And this is going to be level 1. So now we're grabbing the first dropdown, getting the value out of it. And what we're going to do with that value, we're going to use that function that we made here, make dropdown. And this accepts, if you remember, this array. And it also accepts what we want to filter this to. And that's going to be this. I'm going to name this actually value. All of this is going to get a lot better once we get to using classes and things like that. But for now, I'm just going to keep it simple. So we got this variable select level 1 value, which is going to go get the value. And then we're going to populate our dropdown using that value. Now we need this function to run when we change this first dropdown. So this is where we're going to go to our code and add an event listener. And we're going to add an event listener to that level 1 dropdown. And we can do that by first finding that dropdown and then add an event listener. And the event we'll be listening to is going to be called change. So when that dropdown value changes, we want to run this function apply dropdown. So I'm going to save this and go back and look at this. So as you can see, nothing is populated in the second box. Let's go ahead and change this to Toyota. Now you can see how that populated this to Corolla and Camry. Now if I go to Honda, now you'll see that it has Corolla, Camry, and also these others. So every time we click on this, it keeps adding to the list. But we don't want to do that. We need this to populate with new options only. So for that reason, I'm going to go back to this. And we have this make dropdown function, and that's this one right here. Before we take this level 2 and populate it with all these options, let's make sure we clear that level 2 so it's empty. So I'm going to take that level 2. I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm just going to make inner HTML blank, like this. So now if I save this and go back, we have this. If I change it to Toyota, we have these two. If I change it to Honda, we have these two. If I change it to this, see, we have these 3 options. So now we have something that almost works. There's nothing here for Ford apparently. So what we need to do now, if you've noticed when the page just loaded, there is nothing populated. We can do that by running this apply dropdown after the page loads as well. So I'm going to do that by, again, doing document. And we're going to add an event listener to our document. And the event we're listening to here is DOM content loaded. When that happens, we can also just make sure we run that apply dropdown function. So if I save this and go back and reload this, that doesn't work because I didn't spell this right. Let's go back and take a look, save this, reload this, and now see on load, we already have this populated. Now I'm going to do a little change here. I'm going to create a function. And instead of calling this apply dropdown immediately after the document is loaded, I'm just going to call this function. And in this function, I'll just call this apply dropdown, which should now just accomplish exactly the same thing. I'm doing this because I'm probably going to need other things to happen too when the page loads. So right now, it should not change anything. So the next part is to not populate this manually, which is what I did here by typing all these options, but populate it automatically. So I'm going to remove all of this and just keep this level 1, level 2. That's pretty much it. So what I need to happen here, I need to populate this list with all the appropriate options from this first column. So that means we need to get unique list from this column and then apply it to that list. How can we get a unique list? Well, I already kind of did show you how to do that. We did this here. I could just go and write that function completely separately, but we're kind of doing the same thing here by getting a unique list. So it would be nice to just have a function that just gives us a unique list so we can use it in different cases. So we don't have to rewrite this code every single time. So I'm going to go here and create a function. Now in this function, I'm going to just go on top and copy the code that I wrote here. Paste it in this function. So what this function needs to do, we need to send it some sort of array. So I'm going to call it data. We're going to create this unique options set. And then what we're going to do, we're going to take our data instead of our filtered array, run a for each loop. And then what we do, we just populate this unique options list with one of the columns. So we also need to send the index. Instead of using this one, I'm just going to use the index. And then here, instead of saving this to a variable, we'll just return that array. So now with this function, I should be able to just save this, take this function, go back to the code that I wrote before, which is in here. And instead of doing all of these things right here, I'm just gonna remove these two lines and also this and replace it with this function. And this function is gonna accept the data, which in this case, it's gonna be this filtered array, and also the index. So the column I was doing that with was 1. So with this now, this should work the same way without no changes. So we have this now new function that allows us to get unique values, which means now we should be able to use it in other places. In our case, we also want to populate that first level. So I'm going to go here and create another function. And what this function needs to do, it needs to basically just grab our data. And it needs to get unique values. We don't need to filter this at this time. We just need to get unique values from the first column. So that means if we just want to set those, we'll say our unique list equals to, again, we're going to do this, and we're going to set that to be 0 from the first column. And the data we're going to use is that my data variable we have there on top. So now it's going to give us this unique list, which means we need to populate our first dropdown with values from this unique list. If you remember, we already kind of did something like this. We did use this code to take our list and populate it with those options. So again, since we're doing this all the time, instead of keeping this in here, I'm just going to put it in a separate function. And this function is going to accept two things. So let's look at what it is. Well, we could either do the element or the ID of that element. I think I'm going to do the element. So it's going to accept the element, and it's going to accept the actual list that it needs to use to populate it. So I'm going to go here and do L for element and list as array. And in here, I'm just going to go on top there and copy what we were doing here. Go back to that function and paste it. And here, basically our element is going to be this, what used to be select level 2. So I'm going to replace it with our element. So we're going to take that element and clear what's in it. And then what we're going to do, we're going to take that element and append all these options to it. And those options are going to be coming from this list as array that we'll be passing to this function. This is not going to be returning anything. It will just populate our dropdown, and I'm going to spell that right. So now we have this function to populate a dropdown, which means we should be able to use it. So I'm going to copy, go back to my function I did on top here, and instead of doing all of this, I'm just going to replace it with this line that says populate dropdown. And we're going to pass this function, that element, which is this element we found by its ID. And I'm also going to pass it the list, which is this unique list we're providing that function, which should basically just do the same thing, but now we have a function for it, which means we should be able to use it, which I'm going to do by copying that same thing, scroll down, and get to this. Remember, we were trying to populate this first level dropdown, and we just got the unique list. So that means we should be able to populate that with, again, this unique list, which is called the same in this case. And I need to also pass the element. And the ID for our level 1 dropdown is conveniently called level 1. And then I'm going to take that and pass that L to this. Now that's good. Now what should happen? This function that's called populate first level dropdown should just populate our first level dropdown. There's nothing in our code telling that function to run. So the way we're going to make it run, we already did this when the document loads. We're going to run this function after document loads. And if we scroll up and find that, what we'll do, we'll say, after the document loads, let's go ahead and populate that first level dropdown by running this function. And then we're going to do this apply dropdown, which was doing our second level. So if I save this, let's see what happens. So if I go back to this, see it's populated Honda and Civic. And if I open this, see there is no Ford anymore because it's now using the list. And we have these. And now we have this third one, which has these options. So now we have our 2-level dropdown populating from this list. And if I go ahead and add more options to this, I'm going to save this. If I go back and look at this, see we have BMW as one of the options. And if I choose that, that automatically picks up what this is. And for us, it's just 2 levels, so it's just using 2 levels. So far we were able to build this 2-level dropdown. Now you can already see how this code is getting very complicated. We have to jump through all of these different functions all over the place, back and forth. It's getting very hard to manage. But for now, let's do the 3rd level. So what do I have to do the 3rd level? Well, I have to now take my array here and filter by these first 2 values. So if we want to do Toyota Corolla combination, then we need to filter it to just Toyota Corollas and get the values now from the 3rd column. In order for me to do this, we need to, again, do this filter. So now this current filter we have is a filter, but it's only filtering by the 1st column. Now I would like to make a filter that would be able to filter by any number of columns instead of just filtering by one of the columns. So let's go ahead and create a filter function, hopefully, that will handle as many levels of filtering as we need instead of just 1 level. And this function should accept arguments we should be filtering by and the array we should be filtering. So I'm going to say data for our array. And as the filter arguments, we'll just use an array. Basically, just to show you how we would use this function, we would do something like filter array. And then we would pass, let's say, my data as our data we're trying to filter. And if we were trying to filter by 1 column, we would just pass an array and say, this is going to be Toyota. And if we want to filter this by, let's say, 2 columns, then we will do something like this and add the column. And if we wanted 3 columns, you see where this is going. We could just keep adding. So that's the way I want this function to work. We're going to do data and filters as array, I guess. Assuming this data is going to be an array, that's going to have this filter method on it. And the way this filter works, we can take each row and then return the rows that match certain criteria. So for example, if it's row 0 and we want to filter it to the first argument from filters array, then it's going to be this filters array also 0, because the first argument in that list is going to be the first column we should be filtering by. Now, if I have a second column I need to filter this by, then I'm going to have to do this and then do this. And then if we need to do the third one, we need to basically just keep doing this. Now, if you see the pattern here, we basically go 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2 with all of these and arguments. So I'm not going to know how many columns we're going to have. So I'm not going to be able to build this code like this. Instead, what I'm going to do, so for each row, I'm going to take this filters array and I'm going to run every method on this. So this every method is going to accept the item. So that item is going to be one of these filters that we give it. So if you give it like the first one would be Toyota, the second one could be Corolla, right? Something like this. Now, however, we can also pass two things to this because this callback also can accept a second parameter, which we'll call I as the index, which gives us 0, 1, 2 with every option. So if you have just one, you're just going to get a 0. If you have two filters, you'll get 0, 1. If you have 4, you get 0, 1, 2, 3. So what that's going to allow me to do, I can take this and check it against that item in that index of the row. Because what's going to happen with the first column, when we have Toyota, for example, here, what we need to do, we need to make sure that that Toyota, that item, is matching what's in the first column. And the first column is going to come from this row. With the first turn, this is going to be 0, which is going to be the item from the first column. Then with the second turn, this item is going to be the second filter argument, which is also going to turn this to 1. So it's going to go to the second column filter. And so on and so on and so on. We should be able to filter this by any columns we want. So I'm going to go ahead and return this. And now we should be able to use this function to get what we need to get. So that means I should be able to copy this, go back on top, and instead of doing this to filter my data, I'm going to replace it with this function. And to this function, I'm going to pass the data, which is coming from here. And I'm going to also pass this filter. And again, the filter needs to be as an array. So I'm going to pass it like this. So if I did everything accurately here, if I save this and go back and look, we should get the same results. Let's go check it out. See, this still works. So this is still accomplishing the same thing, but now we have this function that we can reuse by as many columns as we need. So let's now get to filtering the second level. So now what I need to do, I need to make sure when you do the second level, we get now a third dropdown to get us these options from the third level. So let's go ahead and create that select, which is going to be that third level. And we're going to have to create a function to populate that. Okay, so we were able to kind of get to this. We should be able to create this in a way that's more reusable so we can use it in many different situations. One piece that we're using here is, well, this filter array. We may have to rethink the way we're doing this. So instead of passing this as an array here, maybe we'll take this argument as an array to this function so it's more reusable. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this array disappear here. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pass that as an array when I'm using this make dropdown function, which means when I do this here, when I'm saying make dropdown, when I pass this, I'm going to pass it here as an array. Let's actually do a semicolon here to finish this line. So this way we should be able to work with this outside of this function in a similar way. So we can pass 2, 3, 4 if we have to. So now if I save this, this should work the same way, hopefully. Yep, and it does. The second thing I'm going to have to do is getting unique values. Right now, we're getting those unique values from column number 1. So the reason this is column number 1 is because if we're filtering this to, let's say, just one level, then we're going to have to get that from the next column after that. If we had to filter this by 2 levels, then we would have to get the information from the next column after that. So if we're just filtering by the first level, then let's get the second column. If second, third, and so on. We can simply do that instead of passing this 1 in this particular situation, we can just take this array that we said level 1 filter, which I'm actually just going to replace with filters as array level 1 filter like this. So I'm going to replace both of these to be the same. I can take this and just calculate the length of that array. Because what's going to happen if we just pass an array with 2 filters, it's going to calculate the length and get 2. And when we have 2, we need to get stuff from the third column. And coincidentally, because the index starts from 0, that 2 would be the third column already. So if we have just 1 column, it will calculate the length as 1, and 1 would be the second column. So that's always 1 more because of the index, how it works, which means now we don't have to hard code this. We can just say get the unique values after you filter this and get the next column after that. So what else are we missing in here? Which element is going to be populated? What we'll do instead of getting this information here, we'll just do this to be that target element. And then we'll just move this as an argument to outside of this function, which is this make dropdown. So what we can do, we can find that element here and then pass that element as the third argument in this function. And that should work out fine. So let's actually delete some of these lines, test this to see what happens. So if we go back and reload this, hopefully it should be exactly the same thing. So this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to make sure that we're changing this without actually breaking our existing code. But now what I did by doing this, I made this function that's called make dropdown that should be able to populate any dropdown by any filters I want to apply to this. I can just take this apply dropdown function and copy the same thing and say apply dropdown to. In this, what we want to do, we want to get the values from the first and second dropdowns, filter, and populate the third dropdown. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this twice, and I'm going to say this is level 2 value, and this will be level 2 in this case. So this will be the value from the first select box. This is the value from the second select box. And we need to get the third select box because we're going to need to populate that box. So now to use this make dropdown function to do this, well, my data is still the same data that's globally available here. So we don't have to touch that. The column filters we need to use, now it's going to be 2 of them, and we can comma separate level 1 and level 2s. And finally, we need to populate the level 3. Now we need to make sure that function is being triggered at some point. Now let's see, how did we trigger this apply dropdown? We did this after the document loaded. We just said run this function, right? Now when do we want this dropdown level 2 function to run? We want it to run when we basically pick something from this list 2, and possibly when we also run the first one. So when we select something from this list 2, we want that to run. So we're going to create an event for that. I'm going to scroll down and create an event. And that's when the second target element is changed. We want to run apply dropdown to. So what is that apply dropdown to when we trigger that? Well, that's the function we just created. So I'm going to save it. Let's see what problems we're going to have with this and also what's good about this, hopefully. So if I go back to this, if I open this, see I have Honda, I go to Toyota, I go from Corolla to Camry. Now I got the options for Camry. Let's go check if that's actually correct according to our list. So Camry, see, apparently I have 2 that is exactly the same thing. Reload this. So now again, Toyota, let's go Camry, and we got hybrid, not hybrid. And if I go to Corolla, we have regular, hybrid. See, we have the options. If I go to this, E-Class, we got these. If I do S-Class, I got these. It almost kind of works. So what are the problems with this? If I go back to, let's say, Honda, see, this is still staying with those options before. So when we select this first level, that populates the second level dropdown, but it should also repopulate this third level so it doesn't stay with old values. So what we can do, we can make sure that we run this function, which is called apply dropdown to, when we trigger the function to run the first dropdown. So the first dropdown is this level 1, and that's apply dropdown function. So if we go back on top here and find that apply dropdown, it basically just applies the dropdown for the first level. After that, we also want to run the second level dropdown function to make sure that happens as well. So I'm going to save it, go back, and at this point, what should happen? If I go to Toyota, see, I have this, and this is Corolla and regular Camry, and it does all of that. And Honda, I do my levels here. I do this. We got S-Class, we got all the options. C-Class, we got the options. See how it works? And it also worked, if you've noticed, when the page loads. And the reason that worked when the page loads is because what happens in our code, when the page loads, we'll run this after document loads function. Now what that function does, it runs this function, populate first level dropdown, and it's also running this function apply dropdown. Now that apply dropdown is this function where we already set to, once you're done, run the third level dropdown too. So this is the way we can approach this on a basic level. This is very hard to expand, even though we did some functions to be able to do this in a better way, so they work with more columns and things like that. Once you get to 5 level dropdown and you need like 3 of those 5 level dropdowns, you are going to have a nightmare managing this entire code. And for that, we're going to move on to taking this concept that we did here and creating a class that will basically handle all of this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to leave what we've done here and create 2 new files, one HTML, one JavaScript. So what I'm going to do in my HTML, I'm just going to go to the old HTML we did, just copy the same code and simply just paste it. And the only thing I'm going to do is just change this link to the new JavaScript file. Save this and close this old HTML file. Now in this new JavaScript file, that's where we're going to write our code. Now let me give you my vision how I think this is supposed to look like. It's very likely it's going to change as I start coding this. I want the end result to be, I'll go just here and do something like this. And possibly we'll pass the array. Let me just go and copy the array we had. So I want to take this and pass this array right here. And then I want to be able to do something like this. So for example, if I wanted to have this 3 select boxes, if I want this level 3 box to depend on level 1 and level 2 dropdowns, when you change them, I want this to auto-populate, then the way this should look like, this would be level 3. And it will depend on level 1 and level 2. All of these being IDs for those elements. So then if we need to do another one, for example, we'll say we also want this level 2 now to be dependent on level 1, right? So then we would go here and do level 2. And then that depends on just one level, so level 1. And if we had 3 levels, we would just list all 3 right here. I think later on I will take this IDs and replace them with elements, so you can pass elements, that way you can select your elements any way you want. But it should not be a big change. So let's just comment this out for now, and this one probably as well. So what I'm going to do in this part where I'm using the actual class, including this array, I'm going to use vars and old style JavaScript. But when I'm making the actual class, I'm going to use all the new features. So I'm going to start by creating a class, and that class should be, see, Maybe we'll call it not make dropdown, but dropdown. That should be nicer. Just dropdown. So the class is going to be dropdown. And in this class, we're going to have a constructor. And that constructor is going to accept, see, this array here, which we call my data. So as a variable, I'm just going to call it data. That will be the array we'll be passing to this. And what we'll do, we'll just save that in that object. So this way we'll say this data equals to data. Now I'm probably going to add more things here in this constructor later on, but for now that should be fine. So I'll go ahead and save that. Now the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to add a couple of functions that we're going to need. And we should be able to reuse some of the code we've done. So for example, one of the things we need to be able to do, we need to be able to filter our array by 1, 2, 3, 4, so many columns. And if you remember, we already made a function like this before. So I just need that function to be attached to this object here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a function. I'm going to call this filter data. And because this is inside of this class, we don't need the word function. And remember when we were doing this filter function that we did in here, if I can find it, see this filter array, we're passing the data, we're passing filters as array. So that's what I need to receive here, filters as array. And I don't need to pass the data because we're going to get the data from here, from our object. I should be able, like I said, go back and grab this and reuse most of that code. I'm just going to go here and paste it. There is one problem that we're going to have here. There's no data in this because we didn't pass data as one of the parameters, unlike here. But we should be able to get the data from this instance of this object. And the way we can get to it is by getting to this data. So instead of data, this is going to be this dot data. Let me close this so we have more space. So we have filters as array, which is this filters as array. I think that's it. So as of right now, just to show you what I can do with this, I'm just going to go ahead and run this. And we need to open the HTML, not the JavaScript file. So these are our dropdowns that we're planning to populate, but I'm going to open the console. Now, if I go to console, see there's nothing happening here, but we should have that class available. So I should be able to do, well, first of all, we should have the array, my data, already in there. See, this is that array, which is our global variable there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to say var dd equals to new dropdown. And we're going to pass that my data to it. So if I hit enter, see, that does this. Now, if I see what's inside of this dd, I hit enter. See, it says it's an object. And if I open this, that object has this property called data. And that data is pretty much the data we have here. So that's that. That object also has the prototype. And if I open that, see, it has the constructor and it has that function filter data. So what that means is that now if I want to get some results by filtering that data, which is this data right here that's attached to this object, I can just do dd.filter data. And then in parentheses, no star here, I can pass an array, which if you remember how we built this function, we could just give it like 2 things. So let me just look inside of our data. I'm going to go BMWM class. So if I do something like, if I hit enter, see, it gives me a new array back. It's basically just the array filtered out. So I'm going to go back. And we're going to start adding a few other things. So I have to think about what are some common things we've been using in here and kind of apply them in this new function as well. So one other thing we did here, get unique values function. So we need something like that too. So I'm going to copy this, go back and add that to my class as well. And again, no function. So we'll say get unique values. Again, this is accepting data and index. Now, this data, however, was not really the main data set from here. This was just data we were passing to get unique values from. So that's not really this data that we need to use. It's just some arbitrary data. So I'm going to keep that data. Again, maybe I should just rename that to something else so it's not confusing. And we'll use that name in this function. See, data as array over here. So that's it. That should take care of that. Again, the same functions I did there, I can reuse in my class, so I don't have to rewrite them. So we filter the data, we get unique options, and we also populate the dropdown, right? So once we get unique options usually, then the next thing is to put those options in one of these dropdowns. So let's create a function for that too. I'm not sure if we already had something like that. Probably we do. Let's go check it out. I think that's pretty much what we need. So I'm just gonna take all of this and copy that too. Go back to this and paste it in here. Again, remove the word function. So yeah, so all of that should be fine. So the next thing we're gonna need here, we're gonna need some place to store all the information about this dropdowns, which means we're gonna have all of this target dropdown boxes, select elements, whatever you want to call this, that we're going to use to populate those dropdowns. So we need to just save those someplace in our object. So for that, because it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't know how many levels, we're just going to create an array so that we can add to that array. So we're going to create that array when we run the constructor. And what we'll do, we'll just say this targets. So we'll create this property targets on our object and we'll make it an empty array. So now we get to the part where we need to be actually targeting one of these dropdowns and just filling them up. Now what I'm going to do to make this easy to build, I'm going to make sure I fill up the first list manually for now. And later we're going to get rid of this. So let's try to create some way for us to add those options here to our second dropdown in this list. If you remember, I was planning to do something like this, like add target. That one would be this last line. So we want to add it to that level 2, and it depends on level 1. So which means we need to create this add method. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So I'll go here and create that method. And that method is going to accept that object, which I'm just going to call options. And again, that options has nothing to do with the option element. I'm just calling that options because the options we're going to pass is this object. Let's actually just copy an example of that. What we need to do with those options, well, first we need to store a reference to the element that we're targeting. To get the element, we're just going to create some variable here to hold that, and we can find that element by doing document get element by ID. And the ID is going to be this target that's being passed to this. Okay, so the way we can get to that, it's going to be options. And inside of that options, we're going to have this target. So now we'll have a reference to this EL. Now, what do we need to do with this EL? We need to fill it up with our options. And for that, let's for now create another function. So what this function is going to accept to populate the dropdown, it's going to accept the element. And by element, we mean the element that's going to be getting those drop-down options, which will be really like this element we're getting here. And then it's also going to accept all the other elements it depends on. So this should be an array of elements that this is going to be depend on. Now, to do that, we need to be able to pass that. So if we wanted to use this function here, then we need to pass the element. We also need to get the array of elements. So how can we get that array of elements? We have this depends on, and we can just get all those elements and store them in some sort of variable, so we can send it to this function. And that's going to be equal to, so we'll take this array that's being passed to us, and we can get to it by getting our options dot, and it's going to be depends on. And this is going to be an array. So sometimes it's going to be just one, but other times it's going to be level 1, level 2. So we need to loop through that array. So we can do it by doing our map method, because it's going to be an array. And in this map method, we'll take each, in this case, it's an ID, I guess. We'll go find the element by doing document get element by ID. So that's going to be a lot like this one. So I'm going to copy paste this, and we're going to return that, but we're not going to do this. We're going to use that ID. So first time that ID is going to be level 1. Then if you have more, it's going to go through all of them and get all those elements, and it's going to return them because it's a map function to a new array. And that's going to be this L depends on. So one thing we need to do once we receive which elements this depends on, we need to get the values for those and use them as a filter. So if like the second dropdown depends on this first dropdown, then I need to be able to get what's the value in this first dropdown selected, so I can filter my data and narrow it down to those options, right? And what we'll do, we'll take this array, and again, we'll just map through it. And for each element in there, we just want to get the value. So now we should have the value text stored in this array. So this will be elements array, this will be values array. So now using that values array, we should be able to filter our data to get to the subset of our data. So let's create a variable for this. To get this, we need to use this function we already built. We called it filter data. All we need to do is do this dot, because it's inside of this instance, and use filter data function. And this function, if you remember, accepts this array that we're filtering by, which is going to be this array that we've just built here. So once we filter our data to a subset, so assuming this particular case, like if we have Honda, we're going to go ahead and filter our data, and it's basically going to be this array over here, but it's going to remove all these Toyotas, BMWs, etc. So we have this. And at that point, if we're filtering by this just first column, we want the information from second column. In case we're filtering by these two columns, we want the information from the third column. All right, so let's take care of that. So I'm going to go back to this. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to get my unique values using this function, getUniqueValues. We can access that by doing this dot and that function. And this function, if you remember, accepts two things. The data, which is going to be this data to use. So we're going to pass it right in here. And it's also going to accept the index. An index is which column we want unique values from. So how are we going to know what the index is? Well, like I said, if we just filter by one column, the first column, then we need the information from second column. If we filter by two columns, then we need the information from the third column. So it's always one column more than the number of columns we're filtering this by. Which means the way we know how many columns we're filtering this by is by knowing how many values are being passed to us. So if we just take that and get the length, if we have one element, this should give us 1. If we have two element filters, it's going to give us 2. I don't need to do +1 because index for array starts from 0. So if it's just one thing and this gives us 1, it's going to go get information from index number 1, which is with 0 index, the second column, which is exactly what we need. Now, once we have the list to use, we should be able to take that and populate our dropdown. So we have this function for that. We called it populate dropdown. So I'm going to copy that, go here, and again, we can access that function by doing this dot and the rest of this. Now that function doesn't really return anything. It just populates a dropdown. There's no return value like this other functions. So I don't really store it in anything at this point. But what it accepts is the element that is supposed to be populated, which is this EL we've passed to this. And it has the list that we want to use, which is this list to use, which is what's going to go here. So this will be this function. But there is one thing though. I don't want to just populate the dropdown. I want to have a reference to all of these things in my object. So later on, if we have to remove something from that dropdown, we can. If we have to add something, we can. So we have the option to modify it. So instead of just getting this function to run and do what it does here, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to get this function to give me a function back with all of these different results. And every time it's going to return a function that's a little different depending on what we pass to it. So what I'm trying to say, instead of just getting this function to do things, I'm just going to get this function to return this code of the function so that it can be reused. So this is the way I'm going to do it. I'm going to go here and I'm going to say, let's return this function. And we'll use an arrow function. And that function is going to be whatever's in here. So I'm just going to have this entire code as a return function. And because this is returning a function, I'm going to call this create populate dropdown function. All right, so now that we have this and we have a function that creates a function, I should be able to now use that function in this add method. Paste that in here, and I'm going to just save this in a variable. Here, it's passing this element that we got here by doing this document get element by ID, and it's also passing this L depends on. We should probably rename this else depends on, so it's matching this. That's good. So we should be able to grab those things from this add method and create a new function based on what target and depend on element we're passing to this. So now all of this I want to be able to store later on in this targets array. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and create a variable here. This variable will be basically an object which will have the properties we need. I'm going to store the element itself. L is, well, this L, comma. Element it depends on. It's going to be, well, the same one again. I'll use the same name, even though this doesn't have to be the same name as this one. This is the property. I'll also store a reference to the function. So we'll just call it something like func. And that will be this event function. That right now is actually a function that hasn't been executed yet. It's just a reference to the function. So far I have those three references. So now I need actually, other than just storing references to all this stuff, I need to actually execute those things to make sure that I have this working as it's supposed to work. And how is this supposed to work? Now, if I was thinking about just one element, if I was getting this document get element by ID, that's our target, really what I would want to do, I have this L and I have this level 1, which is what it depends on. I would want to take the thing that it depends on, so for example, this first dropdown, and assign a change event. So when you click on Toyota, it runs that function that populates this list. So now to get our elements that need to get that change event, that will be this depends on, which is this element depends on. So I could use that, but I'm probably just going to use this reference we store in our target objects. So I'm going to take that target object, and that inside now has this else depends on that we've created right here. And that should be this array of elements. And this should be one or more elements that we pass from here, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to run a for each loop. And for each one of those elements, we're going to run a callback. And that callback should be to assign an event to that element. So that element is going to be this. And to that element, we're going to add an event listener. And the event we're adding to this is change event. So what function do we want to run when we do this change event? So meaning when you change this dropdown, what function do we need to run? Well, the function that needs to run is all of these steps. If you remember, this is where we need to filter it, get the unique values, and populate the dropdown. And we have that function created here. We called it event function. So I'm just going to copy that and pass that event function that we've created here. And that should basically just attach all those events to those elements. Now, once we did attach those events to those elements, the last thing we need to do, we need to make sure we take this target object and put it inside of this targets. So I'm going to take this dot targets. And to that array, which should be empty at this point, we're going to push this target object. Now let's try to test this and see if this actually works. So I'm just going to try to do this level 2 that depends on level 1 thing. So I'm going to go here and we'll just do this. So the level 2 should depend on level 1. So if I go back and try this out, so right now, as you can see, there's nothing in here, but let's go ahead and change this to Toyota. And again, we got nothing. Now I have to check create populate dropdown function is not defined. Okay, so let's go check what I did. I probably forgot this keyword. Yeah, I did create populate dropdown function here, and to refer to this function, we have to refer it from the instance. So we have to say this dot. All right, let's save this. Go check this again. No errors this time. Let's see what happens in here. So again, nothing here. Now let's change this to Honda. We got Honda's options, so that's good news. Toyota, we got Toyota's options. This, we got those options. BMW, nice. So that kind of works. Very good. So I think with this current setup, we should be able to now immediately add the next level 2. So the level 3, meaning this select box, depends on level 2 and level 1, the first two. So level 1, level 2, that's good. So if I save this, let's go back and check what happens. So again, nothing here. Let's make sure there are no errors. That's good. Now if I change this to Honda, see it went here. Now this also populated right away. If I go to this, that works. If I change it to this, we have C class. If I change it to S class, we have this. How nice is that? So we're able to do the third level just like that. Now let's try to test this with some data that has 4 levels. So I'm just going to type some stuff in here. So these are definitely not right, but now let's try to apply this as a 4-level dropdown. So to do that, I have to create the select elements here. So I'll just do an AJAR here to break this to the next line here. So I'll just keep this simple. I'll call this T1, T2, T3, and T4. And again, for now, we have to populate this first dropdown manually, and then we'll take care of that next. So now to apply this, what I would have to do, just create another one of these. Only now we're going to have geodata, and we're going to have a new variable name. I'll just call it dd2. And then when we're adding our levels, we're just going to say that our T2 is dependent on T1. And then our T3 is dependent on T1 and T2. And then we need another one of these. So hopefully, if this works, we should be in a good shape. So I'm going to save this, go back. Let's take a look. So we have this. Now, if I change this to Canada, that looks pretty good. If I change it to this, that seems to work just fine. Okay, very nice. So now we have, see, two dropdowns. We're basically using the same code base for both of them, and it works just perfectly fine. And if I go back and take a look in my console and console log out that DD, for example, see, it's this object. It has this data, which is the array. And then it has this targets. The targets we have right now the 0, the first one is going to be this. If I hover over it, you'll see that second drop down and then the third drop down. If we open this, we're going to see it has the element reference, it has the elements this depends on, and it has the function that it triggers. And then we have the same for the second one, which has two elements now it depends on, and the element that we're targeting, and same sort of idea here. So good. Let's take care of the loading part. That first, it loads this as well. So we don't want to really populate this first level ourselves. We need to get rid of all of these, and we need to figure out a way to make that happen. So let's go back and think about this. So I still want to be able to do that first level using this add and passing the options. So it would be nice if we could just, similar to how we do this, for the first level, we should be able to change this. So we do level 1, and as depends on, we either don't pass anything here or we pass an empty array, something like this. So it depends on no elements, and the target is level 1. So let's think about what's going to happen with the current setup. So right now, if we do this level 1 thing and we pass an empty array, let's just go look through our options here. We have this options. We're going to pass the target. That's still going to get the element. That's still going to be, now in our case, this is just to think about this. This is going to be level 1, and this is going to be an empty array. So the target is still the target. We're going to get the element. Now, when it says it depends on, well, it's going to be an empty array here. So it's going to try to loop through that empty array. And, well, technically, it will just get back an empty array. But to not get it to do this, we could just also just check if it's empty. Let's just make it an empty array instead of doing this. So I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to say if that option depends on dot length is equal to 0. In that case, we're going to assign an empty array to this. Otherwise, we'll do what we did before. Now with that, we're going to do this event function. Now to this event function, we're passing the element, an element it depends on. Now the element is still going to be this. Element depends on, it's going to be an empty array. Let's go check what happens when we pass an empty array to this function, create populate dropdown function, which is this one right here. So let's see what's going to happen when it's an empty array. Well, it's going to get the values it needs to filter by. It's going to be, again, an empty array, I guess. So maybe we should do the same thing here and do if this dot length equals to 0, then it's going to be an empty array. I'm not even sure we need that array. We might even just make it null. But for now, let's just do that. And otherwise, we'll do this. So it would still be an empty array even if we left it like this with map. But I just want to be more specific about this. Now, the next thing we do here, we filter our data. Now, the thing is, if we have an empty array, we don't really need to filter our data. So what we need to do, we need to make sure that our data to use will be just the original data without actually filtering the data. For that, again, I'll just take this and say if this element it depends on, if that equals to 0, in that case, I want the data to use be this dot data, which is our original data. Otherwise, we want to use the filter and get our data in here. So that will be our data to use, which means we don't really need to do this here and assign an array because we don't really use that in that case. So maybe we'll just make this one null. And now we'll take the data to use and pass it to this unique values function. And we need to get everything when it's the original data. All the first level stuff is the first column, which is index 0. And that will be perfect here because when we pass this empty array, the length of this is going to be 0. So that would work just fine. Now let's scroll down and see what happens after we build this. So after we build this event function, the next thing we do, we take this target object, which stores the element it depends on. It's going to depend on nothing. That's fine for us. And then the function is going to be this function that we've created on top. So this should work just fine as well. Then we're going to take the target object elements on. So what this depends on? Oh, this depends on nothing. So we don't really need to do this, which coincidentally wouldn't run it anyways because this depends on it's going to be an empty array. And then we'll just push it to our targets. So there is one thing though here. So when we do this, this creates the function. We store the reference to that function, but there was nothing here that was saying to actually run that function to populate the list. So we need to make sure we run that function at some point in order for this to happen. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do it here. I'm just going to create another method in this entire thing to actually do the part of running all the functions initially to make sure that everything is populated. So I'm going to leave this like this and create another function and call this one initialize. And what we need to do to initialize this, we've stored all those functions in this object. Well, not here. We're really storing it in this targets. Now, for a second, let me just not do this initialized. Let's just save this, go back, and hopefully I'll be able to explain you what I mean by this. If I go back to our list, see, none of them are populated by default. This is not going to be populated. However, if I go, for example, under DD and look what's in there, I have this and I have targets. And in this targets, for example, the first one is going to be this element, see, that depends on no other elements. And this is the function that we've stored that needs to run to populate that. So that means I should be able to get to that function if I do DD. And in that DD, I have dot targets, which gets me to all of these targets. So if I just run this, you'll see it just gives me an array of all of these. Now I want to, let's say, do the first one only. So if I do targets 0, that's going to be that first one. And in this object, we have EL, EL's depends on, and we have the function. So if I do that dot func, that should be a reference to that function. And if we want to run that function, we should be able to just do this to execute the function. And as soon as I execute it, see how it populated this list on top? So now that populated the first list, but we also need to make sure we populate the second list, which means we would go to targets 1 and also run that function to populate, see, the second list. So we need to run all those functions initially for all of these targets to make sure this populates. And this is what I'm going to do in that initialize method. So if we just loop through all these targets and execute the function, it should be just fine. So to loop through those targets, they're all stored in this instance under this targets. So I'm going to use that in my advantage here. I'm going to say this dot targets, and that will be an array of targets. So I'm going to do for each in that array, for each target in that array, t dot, and that func property, which is a function, and we're going to just execute it. So by doing this, we should be able to just trigger all of those and let it populate it. So now we need to make sure we run this, which we will do over here. So that means I need to add another line, initialize for this object. So right now I have level 1, level 2, level 3, and I have initialized. So if I save this, hopefully, if I go back, this should be populated right away. See, I have all options. And if I change this, this should just work. Very nice. This one doesn't because I forgot to also do it for the second one. So I'm going to do dd2 dot initialize. And I also need to add that first level to this, which I didn't do. So t1, and this will be an empty array. Save this. So now we should have two dropdowns. Both should be populated. Here we go. And to build another one, we just have to do basically the same thing. Now, one other thing we might want to do, now see how I have to do here, like every time I do this dd and then do dd.add, dd.add. I might want to just do this to have chaining available. So I can just chain all of these like that. And there should be no semicolons. So instead of doing what I did before, I want to do this. Now, this shouldn't work right now. If I look here, see I get an error because it says it's undefined. So what's happening is that when I'm doing this add, it should return something so we can add back to it again, add back to it again. And what should it return is the actual instance itself, that same dd, because we were doing dd.dd.dd. So we would like, when we run this, to return that same dd so we can do another dot add to it and another dot add to it, and this works. And for this, we need to just go to this function dot add and make sure when we run this function, in the end, we return the instance itself, which is this. And if we do that, now it should be able to run this and it should work. So let's save this, go back and test this and see if we still get an error. See, no error this time. Everything is nice. There's going to be a little problem here, and I'm going to show you what the problem is. Right now, if I look at that dd, remember we used to just look inside of it to see what's happening. But right now, see, it's undefined. Even though this whole thing works, we cannot go back and check what's happening in the object. And the reason for that is that we're storing this var dd, and the value for that is going to be what comes after this last thing that we run. And the last thing that we run is initialize, which if we go back to our class, initialize, it doesn't return anything. So that's why it's undefined, which means if we want that to be that instance, we need to make sure this one also returns the instance, which is this. So now we should be able to run it and it should just work fine. And at the same time, we should be able to access the instance, see, right there. And we have this, we have the targets, we have the whole thing. So I want to keep this functionality, but I also want to add something that will be so that we could do, instead of all of this, just that. So again, right now, this is going to give us an error, see, because, well, there's no easy drop down. It's not a function. So let's go try to make this happen. Easy drop down, and it's going to accept an array. How does this work? So it's basically T1, it's blank, then T2, it's T1, and then T3, it's the next two. It seems like every time it depends on the next item over. So we need to keep just returning 0, 1, 2, 3 items from the list. And we have this target. So these targets are going to be easy because it's same like the first one, second one, third one, and fourth one. So if we just loop through them, it should just automatically work out. Let's go back and try to build this. So I have this array of IDs. We're just going to loop through that. Now for each one of these, we'll get the item itself. And I'm going to do an arrow function. And this time I'm going to just create this because we may need a couple of lines of code here. And there is also a way for us to use a second parameter in this callback, which is the index, which means this item is going to be one of the IDs. And this is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 with each one of those. Now, basically in this loop, we need to do these lines that we're doing here, like dot add this, dot add that, dot add the third one. So let's create this option in that loop. So let's create an option that should look somewhat similar to this. Now, the target is going to be whatever ID is being passed to it. So that's going to be the item, because we're looping through that array, and our array is going to be basically, it's going to be level 1, level 2, level 3 to level 4, meaning that will be the target. First time it's level 1, level 2, then level 3. So that's good. Now depends on needs to be an array. And the way that array is, the first time it needs to be an empty array. Second time it needs to be level 1. And we should be able to do that by taking that array list. And the first time we need to get none of those items. The second time we need to get the first one. So we should be able to use slice to do this. So if we do slice, I want to basically slice the array, get a part of it. For all of them, I'm going to start from the beginning of the array. But how far from that array I'm going to go is going to depend on which iteration I'm on. So if I just use that I, the first iteration is 0. So the first slice 0 through 0 will be an empty array. And then the second time is going to be 0, 1. We'll grab the first one. And then the second one. I think that should work. So that's good. The other thing here, this is just doing the options. The options is not enough. We need to run the add with those options. So we need to go here and do this dot add to call that function. And to that, we're going to pass this argument right here, options. Now that should take care of this add part, but it will not take care of this initialize. So we need to make sure after we run all these, then we initialize the whole thing. We can do it by either doing .initialize in there, but since this is the easy dropdown, I don't want to do that. So instead, I'll just run initialize right in here in this method for that instance, like so. I think that should do it. So let's just see, does this work or not? So the first one apparently runs. I want to see if I have a reference to it. Element is null. Okay. Let's go check out what happened here. Oh, we only have 3 levels. I'm trying to do level 4 ID, which doesn't exist. All right, save this. There are 4 levels for this one, 3 levels for this one. Okay, fair enough. Let's go back and check if that was the problem. All right, good news. So that works here. This works in here. Good. Now I want to check if there are references though, since I'm on this. Does this return a reference? No, that's not good. And this one, it does. So we want to make sure this one also returns a reference to that object. And that's the one that we did with this easy dropdown. So we need to make sure again we return the instance. Save this, go back and just check this out. So now we should have these working. Yep, let's see if there is an instance. We do. So we have this, we have all this stored. And if we go to dd2, that will have its own data in this array, and it will have its own targets. Great. So now we have also a helper easy dropdown that will just let us do this. So we should be able now to use this on that second one as well. So I should be able to basically just take this, copy this, go back, and instead of doing all of that, I can just say this equals to, we're going to use geodata, and this will be T1, T2, T3, and T4. And we also don't need all of these anymore. So now this should do the same thing, hopefully. So let's go check this out. So, yep. So I think that's all I'm going to do in this video. Just the last thing that I'm going to show you is that once we have this all ready, this bottom part I just did with the old syntax. So this should work in all browsers. But this one that I did with the class is probably not going to be compatible. So what you could do again, just copy that code, go to Babel, and get it converted to a compatible version. So just to show you again, I go to this, I take this code, and this is the try it out, and paste it in here. And now this should give us our compatible version. So I should be able to now just grab all of that, copy it, and not to mess around with what I did here, let me create another JavaScript file here and just paste it in here. So that will be all of that we did on top. And then to run the bottom part, I'll just copy this, go back and paste in here, remove these. Basically, all we have to do is just have the array and create the dropdown. Have the array, create the dropdown. Now I want to make sure I try this if I run this final file instead of the file we were running. If everything works well, this should load the same way. Very good. And that way you should have a final code. Now, there are definitely places to improve this, many that I can think of right away. So one thing would be to create a couple of other methods. One is to remove one of the events that you've assigned to the dropdowns. So maybe you want to remove one of them, or maybe another one like destroy method to remove all the things you've assigned, because you can't just go and delete one of these. You have to remove all those event listeners we're adding. So those would be some good methods to add to this. For now, this should be plenty, and it should give you an idea how you can use classes, how we can use functions that return other functions, which is essentially what a closure is, I guess, and how we can reuse the same code base. And now this should be a lot more easier to manage compared to this. And that should be it for this video. Hopefully that was helpful. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.